A child born into hardship often carries the weight of the past into the future. When a heart is hardened by violence, it learns to speak in the only language it knows. Love and loss are the twin architects of fate. One builds, the other destroys. When justice and vengeance blur, the law becomes a sword without mercy. A system built on retribution often fails to see the man behind the crime. Welcome to another episode on Crime Matinee, where we deep dive into chilling stories that reveal the darkest corners of human behavior and the lessons we can learn from them. Today's tale about the story of Keith Sigmon is one of pain, obsession, and a justice system seeking closure through death. Brad Sigmon's journey was carved by circumstances beyond his control. Abuse, instability, and generational cycles of violence. Raised in a turbulent home, he grew into a man burdened by unhealed wounds. Love became possession, rejection turned into rage, and rage led to murder. A legal system that promises justice ultimately became a vehicle for vengeance, entangling Sigmon in a battle not just for his life, but for the meaning of justice its very self. His case would reignite the debate over capital punishment, making him both a symbol and a casualty of the state's hunger for retribution. This is a story of a man, his crime, and a nation's reckoning with the morality of death as justice. Keith Sigmon entered the world on November 12, 1957, in South Carolina, the firstborn of what would become a family of 5 children. His mother, Virginia Wooten, was just 17 years old at the time of his birth, practically a child herself, thrust into the burdens of motherhood long before she had fully matured. His father, Ronnie Sigmon, was a member of the United States military, a profession that not only required frequent relocations, but also carried with it the emotional toil and instability that came with military life. From the outset, Brad's home life was defined by instability. His father, though a provider, was an alcoholic with a violent streak. The marriage between Ronnie and Virginia was fraught with domestic abuse, and it was Brad who bore the brunt of his father's rage. Unlike his 4 younger siblings, who were spared from physical abuse, Brad became the protector of his mother, often standing between his father's fists and her fragile frame. For this, he suffered beatings that left both physical and emotional scars, shaping his understanding of love, power, and violence. The military lifestyle meant constant movement, a lack of roots, and a fragmented sense of home. Shortly after the birth of the youngest Sigmon sibling, the family relocated to the Philippines, where they lived for a brief period. However, the distance and cultural displacement did nothing to repair the damage already present in the Sigmon household. As the years passed, Ronnie's alcoholism worsened and the abuse escalated. Unable to endure the cycle of violence any longer, Virginia divorced Ronnie while Brad was still young. Yet, freedom from one troubled household did not equate to stability. Virginia soon remarried, as did Ronnie, and Brad found himself shuffling between households, never fully belonging in either. This instability further fractured his sense of security and identity. At a young age, Brad took on responsibilities that no child should have to bear. As the eldest, he felt obligated to help raise his siblings in the absence of reliable parental figures. The divorce and subsequent remarriages only heightened his sense of duty, but also reinforced a deep-seated resentment toward a world that had never seemed to offer him stability or love without any conditions. Despite his turbulent home life, Brad's childhood was not devoid of hope. He spent much of his early years in Taylors and Greer, South Carolina, where he attended school and tried to carve out a sense of normalcy. There were moments when he found solace in friendships, in simple joys, and in the promise that adulthood might bring him the control over his life that childhood had denied him. At 16, Brad took on his first job while still attending high school in Simpsonville. This was not merely a teenage experiment in financial independence. It was a necessity. His family's financial struggles meant that he had to work to contribute to household expenses. His wages, however modest, helped to ease the burden on his mother, who was raising multiple children with limited means. This early immersion into adult responsibilities reinforced his self-reliance, but also fostered a growing resentment toward his circumstances, toward his absent father, and toward a life that seemed rigged against him from the start. Yet, despite these hardships, Brad was described as a caring son, a protective older brother, and a young man with potential. He had dreams, ambitions, and, at least in the beginning, the capacity for love and connection. Just when he seemed poised to break free from the chaos of his upbringing, Brad took his first step into the criminal world. At 18, he was arrested for armed robbery in Greer on May 29, 1976. This marked the beginning of his descent, a sharp contrast to the hard-working teenager who had shouldered adult responsibilities. At the same time, love entered his life, offering both hope and another kind of responsibility. In 1977, at just 19 years old, he dropped out of high school 9 weeks before graduation to marry his young bride. Together, they moved away from upstate South Carolina, settled in Manning, South Carolina, where they attempted to build a life of their own. Marriage brought a new kind of stability, and soon after, they welcomed a son. Fatherhood was one of the few bright spots in Brad's life. Those who knew him during this period recall that, despite his flaws, he was a devoted father. His parents, siblings, stepfather, and aunt all described him as a loving family man, someone who deeply cared for his son and his relatives. But demons do not vanish overnight. The trauma of his past, the anger that had been instilled in him from childhood, and his struggles with drug use and mental health issues loomed over him like a shadow. Addiction crept into his life, further corroding his relationships and complicating his future. By the 1990s, Sigmon found himself back in Greenville County, specifically in the city of Greenville. The move represented a full circle moment. He had left as a young man, seeking stability, only to return a hardened adult, battling his inner demons. The life he had tried to escape had ultimately pulled him back in. At this point, his struggles with substance abuse were evident. His use of drugs and alcohol became more pronounced, and while he still held on to the love of his family, his personal life was unraveling. He had already veered into crime in his youth, and now, as an adult, his impulses, addictions, and unresolved trauma were brewing into something far more dangerous. It was in Greenville that he would eventually meet Rebecca Barbare, the woman who would play a pivotal role in his tragic spiral. Their relationship, passionate but volatile, lasted 3 years, with Rebecca eventually ending things in early 2001. The breakup devastated Sigmon, exacerbating his already fragile mental state. This heartbreak, coupled with his past trauma, his addictions, and his growing instability, set the stage for the horrors to come. The Brad Sigmon of his youth, a boy who had fought to protect his mother, who had worked to support his family, who had once been a loving father, was gone. In his place stood a man consumed by rage, obsession, and the desperation to reclaim what he had lost. The seeds had been planted. Soon they would bear the bitter fruit of violence. If you've been enjoying Crime Matinee so far, please like and share our videos. Leave a thumbs up and drop comments down below so I can reach out to you. And don't forget to subscribe so you can be notified whenever I drop a new video. Let's continue. Brad Keith Sigmon's early life was a maelstrom of instability, abuse, and responsibility beyond his years. Raised in a volatile home, he served at the hands of his alcoholic father, taking on the role of protector for his mother while his younger siblings remained untouched. The constant movement due to his father's military service left him without a sense of stability, and after his parents' divorce, he found himself bouncing between homes, never truly belonging. Despite these hardships, he showed promise. At 16, he began working to support his family, and his dedication to his younger siblings and mother suggested a capacity for resilience and love. But his troubled past caught up with him. By 18, he had been arrested for armed robbery, and by 19, he had dropped out of high school to marry. For a time, he found meaning in fatherhood, described by family members as a loving father and devoted relative. But addiction and mental health struggles chipped away at him. He returned to Greenville in the 1990s, and by the time he met Rebecca Barbare, he was already a man on the brink. Her decision to leave him in the early 2001 shattered what little control he had left. Obsession replaced love, rage replaced reason, and violence became inevitable. The stage was set for the tragedy of April 27, 2001, when Sigmon's lifelong wounds would finally manifest in their most horrifying form. By April 2001, Brad Keith Sigmon was a man unraveling. The past few months had been spent in a downward spiral of obsession, substance abuse, and increasing paranoia. His 3-year relationship with Rebecca Barbare had ended earlier that year, a separation he could not accept. She had been his last tether to normalcy, and when she left, his world collapsed into desperation. Sigmon stalked Rebecca, convinced she had found another man. We drove past her parents' house, constantly trying to catch glimpses of her, trying to find proof that she had moved on. His fixation became all-consuming. His drug use, particularly cocaine and alcohol, escalated, clouding his judgment and intensifying his violent urges. He spoke to friends about wanting to get hold of Rebecca, refusing to let her go. On the night of April 26, 2001, Sigmon and a friend, Eugene Strube, drank heavily and used cocaine together. Fueled by substance-induced delusions, Sigmon revealed his plan for the following morning. He intended to go to the Larke household, tie up Rebecca's parents, and force Rebecca to reconcile with him. Strube, initially a passive listener, later decided he wanted no part in it and backed out, leaving Sigmon to carry out his deadly intentions alone. The morning of April 27, 2001 was the turning point. Sigmon, armed with a baseball bat, entered the Larke home on East Darby Road in Taylors, South Carolina. He found 62-year-old David Larke in the kitchen and 59-year-old Gladys Larke in the living room. With blind rage, he struck David first, the bat cracking against his skull. As David collapsed, Sigmon moved to Gladys, bringing the bat down on her head again and again, but he did not stop there. He returned to David, attacking him further, then back to Gladys, alternating his blows between the two helpless victims. Each suffered 9 massive strikes to the head, their skulls shattered beyond recognition. After murdering them, Sigmon stole David's gun. His mission was not complete. He now waited for Rebecca to return home. Sometime later, Rebecca arrived at her parents' house, unaware of the horror inside. As soon as she stepped through the door, she was met by Sigmon holding a gun. He forced her back outside and into a car. His plan was clear: take her away, possess her, reclaim control. Sigmon's destination was North Carolina, but he never made it that far. Somewhere along the drive, Rebecca saw her chance. She jumped out of the moving car and ran for her life. Sigmon, in a fit of panic and rage, fired his gun at her, but the shots missed. His plan was unraveling. With Rebecca now beyond his reach, he had no choice but to flee. As news of the murders broke, law enforcement launched a manhunt for Sigmon. A warrant was issued, listing charges of double murder, kidnapping, and assault with intent to kill. For 11 days, he remained on the run, making his way to Gatlinburg, Tennessee. He had no clear plan, no real escape route. He was a man merely prolonging the inevitable. Authorities eventually tracked him down, and on May 8, 2001, Sigmon was captured in Tennessee. Extradited back to South Carolina, he would now face the full weight of the law. Once in custody, the gravity of his crimes became undeniable. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His own admissions, the stolen gun, Rebecca's eyewitness account, and the sheer brutality of the crime scene. In June 2001, a South Carolina grand jury indicted Sigmon on the following charges: 2 counts of murder, first-degree burglary, kidnapping, and assault with intent to kill. The state made its intentions clear. It would seek the death penalty. After more than a year in Greenville County Jail, Brad Sigmon's trial began in July 2002. His fate rested in the hands of a jury that would decide whether he lived or died. The prosecution painted Sigmon as a man driven by obsession, fueled by rage, and utterly without remorse. They described the heinous brutality of the murders, how the Larkes endured a slow and agonizing death, and how Sigmon stalked Rebecca for weeks before finally acting on his darkest impulses. They highlighted the premeditation of the crime, the merciless nature of the killings, the terror inflicted on Rebecca Barbare. Their message was simple: Sigmon showed no mercy. Why should the jury? The defense acknowledged Sigmon's guilt, but pleaded for life imprisonment instead of death. They pointed to the facts of his traumatic childhood, his lifelong struggle with mental health issues, drug addiction, and good behavior in jail. They argued that Sigmon was not beyond redemption, but that his actions were the product of a broken mind and not an inherently evil soul. Sigmon did not deny his crimes. In court, he admitted his guilt, though he tried to explain his state of mind, his heartbreak, his rage, his lack of control. But to the jury, the facts outweighed the excuses. The jury deliberated. The unanimous decision came swiftly: guilty of murder, guilty of first-degree burglary, and guilty of kidnapping. And then came the ultimate judgment. The jury unanimously sentenced Brad Keith Sigmon to death, twice over, for the murders of David and Gladys Larke. For the burglary charge, he received an additional 30 years in prison. The courtroom was silent, save for the devastated family of the victims, who had waited over a year for this moment. Justice had spoken. Sigmon was escorted out of the courtroom in chains, now officially a condemned man, destined for death row. If you've been enjoying Crime Matinee so far, please like and share our videos. Leave a thumbs up and drop comments down below so I can reach out to you. And don't forget to subscribe so you can be notified whenever I drop a new video. Let's continue. Brad Sigmon's obsession with his ex-girlfriend Rebecca Barbare reached its breaking point. Fueled by cocaine, alcohol, and paranoia, he executed a plan to force Rebecca back into his life. But instead of mere abduction, his rage escalated into cold-blooded murder. He bludgeoned her parents, David and Gladys Larke, to death with a baseball bat, crushing their skulls with 9 vicious blows each. Sigmon then kidnapped Rebecca, but she escaped his clutches, leading to a frantic 11-day manhunt. His capture in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, marks the beginning of his journey toward execution. By July 2002, after a high-profile trial, Sigmon was convicted of double murder, burglary and kidnapping. The jury, unmoved by his traumatic past, sentenced him to death. His fate was sealed. Brad Keith Sigmon would die for his crimes, though it would take over 2 decades for that sentence to be carried out. His trial in July 2002 was swift. He admitted guilt. The prosecution sought death. The defense pleaded for mercy, citing a life of trauma, a man broken long before he ever lifted that bat. But the jury saw the bloodied bodies of David and Gladys Larke and chose retribution. Death, twice over. Sigmon will spend the next 2 decades on death row, a man marked for execution, but not yet executed. The appeals came and went, denied, delayed, dismissed. He languished in a purgatory of his own making. Justice in America is not always swift, nor is it always fair. In 2021, South Carolina faced a problem. They had men sentenced to die, but no means to kill them. Lethal injection drugs had run dry. Suppliers unwilling to be complicit in state-sanctioned death. The state's response? Bring back the old ways. Electrocution. The firing squad. Sigmon became the test case. The man whose death would break a 13-year execution drought. But he refused the electric chair, fearing a slow and torturous death. He feared lethal injection, knowing others had gasped for air long after they were declared unconscious. The firing squad, he decided, was the lesser evil. On March the 7th, 2025, the sun rose for Brad Keith Sigmon one last time. His final meal, KFC, mashed potatoes, biscuits, cheesecake, sweet tea. He had wanted to share it with other inmates, but the system denied him even that small mercy. Strapped to a chair, hooded, a red target placed over his heart, he spoke his last words, quoting, "Nowhere does God in the New Testament give man the authority to kill another man. I want my closing statement to be one of love and a calling to my fellow Christians to help us end the death penalty. We are now under God's grace and mercy." His final words, a call to his fellow Christians to remember that vengeance belongs to God alone. The rifles fired at 6:05 p.m. His body jerked, his chest rose and fell. At 6:08 he was pronounced dead. South Carolina had carried out its first execution by firing squad in 15 years. Sigmon became the 4th man in modern US history to die this way. A life of suffering often breeds more suffering. Brad Sigmon was a man forged by pain, one who became both a perpetrator and a victim of the cycles of violence that shaped him. Justice without mercy becomes vengeance, and the law, in its rigid pursuit of retribution, often blinds itself to the human behind the crime. His execution, hailed by some as rightful punishment, by others as state-sanctioned murder, forces society to confront an unsettling question. Does killing a killer make us any different? The power to end a life is an immense burden, yet it is wielded as policy, as punishment, as closure, where blood begets blood, and whether by crime or law, death leaves behind wounds that never truly heal. The death penalty remains a mirror in which we see our own morality, our contradictions, and our thirst for a justice that is often indistinguishable from revenge.